In the previous video, I have given you a general overview about the classes of this project and what is the problem that we want to tackle. Now in this video, let's take a look at the single responsibility principle. Let's use the Wikipedia definition. The single responsibility principle, SRP, is a computer programming principle that states that every module, class, or function in a computer program should have responsibility over a single part of that program's functionality, which it should encapsulate. All of that module, class, or function's services should be narrowly aligned with that responsibility. So this is pretty simple. What we want to do is make sure that our class, our single class, takes responsibility for only one thing. So for example, in our game, let's go back to Unity. Okay, we are back in Unity. So let's see how Unity does things to keep their code in a form that is object-oriented friendly. So let's click on the player, and we can see that our player in the hierarchy has rigid body, capsule collider, our own script, and audio source. So what does it mean? Well, it means that Unity uses the component architecture, so we can add a component onto our player game object if it extends the mono behavior. And we can see that, for example, the rigid body 2D component, the purpose of this component is only to allow us to interact with Unity physics engine by making sure that our player game object moves in a way that can, for example, collide with other objects. And this is the sole responsibility for the rigid body. And this is how we should create our scripts to make sure that we can keep everything maintainable. So we have added the player script onto our player game object. If we click on it in our scripts folder, what we can see that our player has multiple responsibilities. So it accesses the animators, the sprite renderer, and the rigid body, for example. Now the problem starts when we want to interact with those. Since the rigid body itself doesn't exactly know how we want to move our object, so it doesn't know if this is a top-down game or a platformer, we would need to explicitly tell its velocity what each value should be or how to add a force to it. And this in turn makes the player responsible for knowing that. Next we have our animator, and animator doesn't know which animation it should play. It only knows that it can play animations, and it's player responsibility now to tell it what animation should be played. So for example, if we slide down to our move player, it plays the walk animation. So sets the bool for walk value to true. And this means that our player is also responsible for taking care of setting the appropriate animation on our animator controller. So this makes our player having multiple purposes, and we do not want that. What we would like to do is to split this responsibility between smaller classes that are more specialized. So for example, let's right click and create a new C# script. Let's call it player movement. Okay. And what we would like to do is to make sure that our player movement will access the rigid body and will be able to move our player by affecting the rigid body in a way that we want to have in our game. And what we would like to do in our player script is simply to pass the input from our player to the player movement script and not worry about how the player movement script does things. So it doesn't matter if the player movement uses add force or sets velocity or uses move position on our rigid body. It doesn't matter. Our player is sole responsibility is the communication of values from the player input to the player movement. So we can see that our player is kind of a controller that will pass information. And this in turn makes our task easy, because now we know that we simply can extract all the parameters that are not needed for the communication exchange. So the animator, the sprite renderer, we only want them to appear in the specialized scripts, and then our player script should only pass to those scripts data. And that's how we are going to approach the single responsibility principle to make sure that our player script is responsible only for communicating between a more specialized scripts, and they in turn communicate with the modules of Unity such as capsule, collider, or rigid body, or in our player sprite, the sprite renderer or animator, just to make sure that they have only one responsibility. So in the next video, we are going to refactor our player to use the player movement script to take a look at how it makes our life easier and how we can keep the code more maintainable. So see you in the next video.